Similar deregulation has more recently occurred in Europe, so that cheap flights are possible, and with the same effects. Large numbers of European tourists are travelling across European national borders the way Americans cross US state borders. It's therefore not surprising that Europeans are more internationally minded than Americans, and certainly more so than the Japanese or Chinese. The high-speed trains, TGV in French, also had a similar effect. See section F of this chapter on transport systems. As people get richer, they can afford to go on longer, more expensive foreign trips. It used to be a luxury for Americans to travel to Europe, but nowadays a weekend trip to Paris is not uncommon. Many American students will take themselves off to Europe as part of their general life education. I have a friend living in Brussels now, retired, who takes herself off to other European cities at a rate of almost once a month. The proportion of people travelling internationally keeps rising. Once it is a common experience, as it is already in many European countries, and to a lesser extent in the US, it becomes more acceptable to take a more cosmopolitan view. For example, European intellectuals on the media will often make comparisons with what their neighbouring countries are doing or thinking when debating issues. One of the maddening things I noticed about the American commentators on the US media was that I rarely heard any international comparisons. In that respect, the Americans are definitely more insular-minded, less internationally conscious, more inward-looking and self-congratulatory than are Europeans, for example. In the last decade or so, the Japanese have been touristing a lot more as they have become richer. I remember the 1980s when I happened to be in Paris watching Japanese salaryman husbands handing out piles of large denomination French banknotes to their financially dependent wives to buy expensive brand name handbags and perfumes. The servers at the stores told me in French, that by then I could speak, that the Japanese were by a mile their best customers, and that their company was hiring native Japanese servers to cater to the Japanese clientele. Very recently, the Chinese have started to become tourists. My Brussels friend tells me that now there are many Chinese tourists who come to her city, Brussels. Once direct flights between Shanghai and Brussels were started. The Chinese are getting richer and are starting to travel more. Given the huge size of the Chinese population, it's only a question of time before the Europeans will be saying about the Chinese what they were saying about the Americans in the 1970s. That is, you can't get away from them. As large numbers of Chinese travel to the Western countries and experience for themselves what it feels like to live in a democracy, they will probably feel the same kind of shame about China that the Australians and New Zealanders felt about their own rather backwater countries when the jumbo jets came into service in the 1970s. When millions of Chinese have travelled and returned to China, they will be more motivated to see their own country become modern in the way the countries they have visited are. This makes it only more likely that China will become sooner or later a democratic modern nation, and thus more able to play its part in the creation of a world state. While China's citizens remain poor, monocultured, mean-spirited and narrowly nationalistic, they will not play much of a role in the general cultural homogenization process that is a prerequisite for the creation of a global state. D. Economic growth. One of the major factors in the growth of a global state will be the simple fact that people are getting richer all the time due to simple economic growth. If a country has an economic growth rate of X% a year, then after Y years it will be, all in brackets, 1 plus X over 100 to the power Y times richer. In the case of the US, which has had an average growth rate of about 3% for many decades, it will take about 24 years for its living standard to double. In the case of some Chinese cities, for example Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Shanghai, etc., the growth rate is much higher, say 15%. Then the doubling time is only 5 years. If these eastern Chinese cities can sustain their incredible growth rates, assuming that they are true, then their citizens will be changing their social customs and values very fast as they modernize in many different senses. They will obviously travel more. They will be able to afford the internet and personal computers. They will build their own high-speed train systems between the rich cities and fly cheaply across the country. Economic growth means people get richer, and with money comes greater happiness, despite the popular Beatles song. Research shows that nearly everyone wants to have more money because they can then do more, travel more, buy more agreeable goods such as electric blankets, stereos, cars, DVDs, books, better healthcare, etc. Interesting. List reflects the fact it was written in 2007. Times change. Back to the book. As people get richer and happier, they usually get more tolerant and less mean-spirited. I notice a marked difference in the level of mean-spiritedness, that is, the willingness to exploit a fellow human being and not respect him as a person, between Chinese people living in the richer eastern cities than those of middle China. The Chinese living in the western part of the country are so poor that they will readily exploit other people if they feel they can get away with it. Personally, I've never been so robbed, that is pickpocketed, as I have been in China, and several times. So a basic condition for the creation of a global state is that its members are rich enough to have the appropriate mentality to want to live in a global state. For this reason, it's highly likely that the global state will be formed incrementally, with the richer, more progressive nations joining it first. Perhaps this process is already underway in the form of the European Union, which does not yet conceive of itself as a stepping stone towards the creation of Globa. Perhaps first the North American countries will need to join with the EU to form the Atlantic Union or Northern Union before any real momentum to the creation of Globa is apparent. Only later will the poorer countries join as they attain a sufficient level of wealth and cosmopolitan feeling amongst their citizens. E. Global economy. Which will come first, the creation of a global state or a global economy? In a sense, we already live in a global economy. In a sense, we have been doing so for several centuries already, so it's a matter of degree. It depends on how you define global economy. Certainly, the more international our economies become, the more multi the mentalities of the business people become, due to their international travelling and dealing with other cultures. It's much easier to import a new technology rather than a new social norm into a country, for the simple reason that even one person can import a new technology. Look at Sony's CEO and his introduction of the American-invented transistor into the Japanese transistor radio industry. Airlines know that most of their customers are business travellers, particularly in the more expensive business class. Why else would they use the term business class rather than, say, luxury class? The creation of a global economy is both a cause and an effect of the creation of a global state. The more global the state, the more readily it can legislate a global approach to business, for example by creating world standards for goods and services, thus expanding the size of the market to be fully global, etc. As national economies integrate more and more, it becomes possible to install a common currency and common trade practices. We are seeing more and more economic blocs being formed in the world, as one can really confirm on the internet using Wikipedia with the key phrase list of trade blocs. The list is already long. In fact, when I used the internet to discover the number of trading blocs in the world at the time of writing, that's 2007, I was shocked at just how many there are. The list below contains 50 items, although a few of them are still proposals at the time of writing. I am not a professional economist, nor a political scientist, so had not kept up to date on such matters. In fact, to be truly on top of such things, one would need to be a specialist on the topic. I list these trading blocks here in an alphabetical order, giving at first the acronym, followed by its full title. Occasionally I add a quick explanatory note. Here is the list. Ad-libbing now. Now this list is long, right? It's about 50 odd acronyms, and it gets rather boring. But the whole point of me going through this long list is to make the point that it is a long list. In other words, there are many trade blocs in the world, and that's the point, to emphasize the idea that the world is moving more and more away from the single nation state, at least in the economic arena, towards the trade blocs. So groups of countries, which is a vital stepping stone towards the creation of a global economic bloc, where the size of the bloc is the whole planet. Okay, so here's the list, and I'll just rush through it and expect to be bored because it is boring, but take away the message that there are a lot of trade blocs in the world now. AC, Andean Community. ACS, Association of Caribbean States, proposed. AEC, African Economic Community, proposed. AFTA, Arab Free Trade Area. Agadir, AGADIR, don't know what that is. AL, Arab League. AMU, Arab Maghreb Union. APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN plus 3, that is ASEAN plus China, Japan, South Korea. AU, African Union. CACM, Central American Common Market. CAN, Andean Community of Nations. CARICOM, Caribbean Community. CEC-ASG, Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Gulf. CEFTA, Central European Free Trade Area. CEMAC, Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa. I guess that's a French acronym. CENSAD, CENSAD, Community of Sahel-Saharan States. CEPIA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership for East Asia. CER, Closer Economic Relations, that's Australia and New Zealand. COMESAS, Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. CSN, Union of South American Nations, modelled on EU. EAC, East African Community. EFTA, East Asian Free Trade Area, proposed. EAS, East Asia Summit. ECAS, Economic Community of Central African States. ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. EEA, European Economic Area. EFTA, European Free Trade Area. EU, European Union. EU MEFTA, European Mediterranean Free Trade Area. EURASEC, Eurasian Economic Community. GAFTA, Greater Arab Free Trade Area, 17 countries. GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council. Guam, Organization for Democracy and Economic Development. IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority on Development. Mercosur, Mercado Común del Sur, Common Market of the South. MU, Mediterranean Union. NAFTA, North American Free Trade Area. PATA, Pacific Regional Trade Agreement. SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. SACU, Southern African Customs Union. SADC, Southern African Development Community. SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that's China plus Russia plus 4 of the stands. TAFTA, Transatlantic Free Trade Area, that is EU plus USA, proposed. UMOA, West African Economic and Monetary Union. UNASUR, Union of South American Nations. USAN, Union of South American Nations. US MEFTA, US Middle East Free Trade Area. Some of the above regional economic and trade blocs plan to integrate their economies even further by creating monetary unions, that is, creating a new common currency within the union, equivalent to what the EU did with its euro. Here's a list of those trade blocs, and they're planned by the year of inauguration of the new monetary union. There's only 5 of them. You can relax. EAC by 2009. GCC by 2010, SADC by 2016, UNASUL, UNASUL by 2019, EAC by 2028. When one looks at a world map, with each country colour-coded according to which economic bloc it belongs to, then one sees that nearly all countries are coloured. In other words, at the time of writing, most countries are now members of an economic bloc. This is most encouraging for the globists, for obvious reasons. Tightly integrated economies cannot go to war with each other, so all these many trade blocs augur well for future world peace. The fact that there are some 50 actual proposed trade blocs in the world implies that the planet is already well along the path towards creating a global economic bloc. In fact, we shall see 2 trade blocs merge into a bigger one. In 2007, Mercosur and the Andean Community, AC, plan to merge to form UNASUR, Union of South American Nations. It will have its own currency and parliament and is based on the EU. That's the European Union. There's a proposal of merging the US and the EU into what is to be called TAFTA, Transatlantic Free Trade Area. The Germans are thinking that Europe needs to get bigger to counter the economic powerhouses of China and India. These regional blocs are stepping stones towards the creation of one global economic bloc. when bigger blocks are created as smaller blocks merge. For example, if Mercosur merges with NAFTA to form FTAA, Free Trade Area of the Americas, as the Americans want, or if NAFTA joins with the EU to create an Atlantic Union, etc. Once the powerful business leaders have formed themselves into a global economic bloc, it will then be easier to transform that global economic bloc into a global political bloc, that is, globa. So economic integration is another vital stepping stone towards the creation of a global state. The founders of the EU reasoned that the creation of a common market with a common currency would increase the chances of the creation of a European political union. At the time of writing, it hasn't happened yet, but this process is well underway. Ad-libbing, so 10 years later after I wrote this. Well, look at Brexit, the exit of Britain from the European Union. So things are more complicated. There's now a European Parliament that is elected with growing powers. It's likely soon that there'll be a European constitution or treaty and a European president, a European military, etc. These are all signs of growing European political unification. Ad-libbing now, a lot of that happened. The EU does have a president, and I think there's some kind of military European force, an EU type force. I've not kept up to date. I need to look into this more carefully. I've been doing other things the last decade. The proposed Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, is developing in much the same way as the EU. The South American countries plan to be a union by 2019. Oh, so that's in 2 years at the time that I'm reading this now, filming this now. Once these economic blocks have merged into a global trade bloc, a new unit of currency should be created for it. Let us call this new global currency unit the Globo, analogous to the word euro, the currency unit of the EU. Its symbol could be a capital G with 2 horizontal strokes instead of 1. Again, analogous with the EU's euro sign, or Britain's pound sign, or Japan's yen sign, all with 2 horizontal strokes, or the US dollar with its 2 vertical strokes. The planet already has a World Bank and a World Monetary Fund, the IMF. These are institutions that a world state would need, so several stepping stones towards building a world economy are already in place. More recently, the WTO, World Trade Organization, was formed, which imposes trade conditions and rules on the countries which join it. Even communist dictatorships such as China and Vietnam have joined and are hence obliged to obey the trade rules of the WTO. This uniformity of trade rules and practices means that, economically speaking, the world is increasingly becoming homogeneous, and this is a part of becoming more culturally homogeneous on a global scale. F. Transport systems. Humanity's transport systems keep growing in speed and scale. This section discusses new transport systems and their impact upon the creation of global cultural homogeneity and hence globism. I begin with the most potent of transport systems that have already created millions of multis due to global travel, particularly amongst business people, namely the jumbo jet. The jumbo jet came into the world in the early 1970s. At the time, it was a giant, hence the term jumbo jet. That is, as big as an elephant. Huge, and it was. It was so large that it could carry several hundred passengers, most of whom are crammed into economy class with just enough legroom to read a book, but not to sleep. The large number of passengers meant that the price of travelling halfway around the world dropped significantly and created a new mass market. The term jet set started to lose its glamour. The jet set were the rich people who could afford to travel on the first passenger jets. Their multi-mentalities, their multicultured sophistication made them superior people in the eyes of the non-jet set. They were people to be admired by ordinary people. But the jumbo jet brought ordinary people into the jet set, so the term lost its sting and faded away, becoming a historical term. At the time of writing, nearly everyone in the rich countries has flown in a passenger jet. Most people in the rich countries have now experienced firsthand what it feels like to be a foreigner in a strange land. This experience broadens the mind by impressing upon a mono mind that one is a mono. Travelling in another culture forces one, if one has any curiosity, to question the unquestioned assumptions of one's own mono culture. The jumbo jet has played an important role in making hundreds of millions of people more cosmopolitan, more aware of and tolerant of cultural differences. It's now possible for world leaders to travel fairly easily to international meetings to diffuse tensions, whereas a century ago this was not possible. The rise of the jumbo jet may be one of the reasons why the second half of the 20th century was so peaceful compared to the horrors of the first half. Another main reason, of course, is the existence of the hydrogen bombs and the possible global extinction they would cause with the nuclear holocaust if ever they were used, so no one dares to start a nuclear war. It's a generally accepted fact that the jumbo jet has made people more world-travelled, more multi. What about the future of the jumbo jet? Will there be further advances of the same kind? Very soon, the European Airbus company will be flying the Super Jumbo, ad-libbing the A380 with, 500, 700? I don't know. But anyway, so pretty well double the size of the number of passengers carried by the jumbo jet of the 70s. For the simple reason that the A380, the Super Jumbo, has two levels, two stories of passenger floors. It's a two-storied plane. Will there be further advances of the same kind? Very soon the European Airbus company will be flying the Super Jumbo that has roughly double the number of passengers of an ordinary jumbo jet because it is a double-decker plane. It has 2 decks of passengers, as in a ship. The 2 decks extend the whole length of the plane, so the number of passengers roughly double. If airlines choose to cram in passengers sardine style as in a jumbo jet, then the Super Jumbo can fly 800 passengers at a time. That will allow twice as many people to become multis as before, until perhaps the first Super Jumbo crashes, killing 800 people. The Super Jumbo will make airfares a lot cheaper through further economies of scale. The cheaper airfares will mean that more people will travel, especially people from the poorer countries and from countries that have dictatorial governments. Such people will learn for themselves how it feels to live for a time in a democratic, rich country and then feel more dissatisfied with their own governments and be more motivated to push for democratic reforms. At the rate that the 200 countries of the world are going democratic, the whole planet should be democratic in less than 40 years. 30 years. Democratization is a global phenomenon and is already 2/3 complete, in the sense that 2/3 of the countries of the world at the time of writing are democracies. The Super Jumbo is a phenomenon of the very near future. What about the longer-term future regarding airplanes? There are plans to build space planes, that is, rocket planes, that take off conventionally like an airplane, but once at high altitude turn on rocket motors and move above the atmosphere at high speeds, that is, at rocket speeds. The total trip time from London to San Francisco, or from Los Angeles to Tokyo or Beijing, would be only a few hours. Once large-scale space planes are built, travelling across the planet will be much easier and a lot faster. This in turn will mean that intercontinental travel will be much less of a hassle, so more people will cross continents, thus further homogenizing the planet culturally. What about other transport system revolutions? On a smaller distance scale than those of airplanes are the distances covered by modern high-speed trains. The 2 most famous high-speed train systems are France's TGV or TGV, Très Grande Vitesse, meaning very high speed, and Japan's Shinkansen, that is new trunk line, that is bullet train. These 2 train types compete with each other regularly to break the world train speed record. These trains can travel very smoothly at speeds of 300 kilometers an hour. The world speed record is over 500 kilometers an hour. These trains are now all over Western Europe, linking such cities as London, Brussels, Paris, Cologne, that's Cologne in English, Amsterdam, etc., and constantly spreading. In a decade or 2, there will probably be a whole network of TGV tracks all over Europe, and that is the case now, linking European countries with a fast, efficient transport service. Business people love the TGV because it's so convenient. It goes from downtown to downtown. One can catch a local metro subway train in one city, get off at another metro stop to pick up the TGV, be in another city and another country in a few hours, get out at a metro stop and pick up the metro train to get to one's final destination in the second city. So convenient and quick and not too expensive. It's not surprising that Europeans are coming together economically and politically, leading the world in political innovation by outmoding the nation-state to to become a regional bloc, a union, the European Union. With the proviso of Brexit, probably a few other countries will also exit the Union. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Back to the book. Another train technology for the not-so-near future is that of Maglev, that is, magnetic levitation. Everyone knows that 2 magnets can repel each other. By generating strong magnetic fields in the train tracks and under the train can be lifted up into the air so that there's no friction between the train and the tracks. Germany and Japan are working hard on this technology. The potential top speed of the Maglev train is superior to that of the TGV. The only real friction is due to the air resistance. These trains could move almost as fast as jet planes. The faster transport systems become, the easier it is for people to move across greater distances. By crossing cultures more easily, people become more easily and in greater numbers, making them more supportive of globism. G. World trade and banking. After a century of socialist planned economies, it's now clear that they are not as efficient at producing wealth and raising the general standard of living of their populations as are capitalist economies. One only had to look at pairs of neighbouring countries where one was socialist and the other capitalist to see the striking differences in living standards. For example, East and West Germany, North and South Korea, China and Japan. At the time of writing, nearly all of these formerly centrally planned economies have switched to capitalistic market-driven economies based on the profit motive, so motivates enterprising individuals to take risks, to work hard at creating wealth and competition, forcing prices down and efficiency up, and generally raising the standard of living. In a centrally planned economy, however, people are more likely to make minimum effort to meet their quotas and rely on the government rather than themselves to improve their lives, thus sapping the country of initiative. There are many success stories of former socialist economies switching their economic systems to the capitalist model, only to see spectacular increases in their growth rates and standards of living. The most spectacular example is, of course, the country I'm currently living in, namely China, with its annual average growth rates of 10%, if one can believe the official statistics. China made the switch in the late 1970s after Mao died and Deng Xiaoping took over. Deng was a pragmatist and visited Japan only to be profoundly shocked at how much richer it was than China. It made a deep impression on him and motivated him to make China rich. India was slower at making the same transition, but it too is now growing very healthily at about 6 to 7% a year. Even conservative Vietnam is going the same way and has recently joined the WTO, World Trade Organization. With most of the former Asian communist countries now having capitalist economies, it's probably only a question of time before a giant Asian union is formed. The Japanese are already proposing it, suggesting that Japan, China, India, Korea and others join it. If this happens, it will be the biggest of its kind in the world, dwarfing the EU, NAFTA, etc. With its mass population of nearly 3 billion people, that is half the population of the Earth. With all these countries, including of course all the older capitalist countries busily engaged in international trade, there's an obvious need for international, even global organizations to determine international trading practices and norms and methods to handle disputes between trading nations. It's for these reasons that the WTO, World Trade Organization, was established. More than 3/4 of all the world's nations have now joined this organization and hence benefit from the advantages that WTO membership provides. For example, low tariff access to other WTO member countries' markets. Such advantages are so great that nearly all nations want to join it. China joined a few years ago. Vietnam has joined. At the time of writing, Russia is pushing to join. Now that so many nations of the world, including the richest and most powerful, have joined the WTO, this implies that almost the whole planet is operating under the same set of international trade rules. Each of these nations operates in the international trade arena according to the same norms. Thus, the homogeneity of trade practices becomes an important component in the homogenization of these cultures. Powerful businessmen have an impact on the policies of nations and on their relations with each other. With most nations abiding by the same trade rules, a global mutual understanding between nations inevitably increases, at least in the area of world trade. Millions of business people then have to travel to meet international clients and customers. All this travel, motivated by business, helps the global cultural homogenization process. The more readily the nations of the world trade with each other, the more travel there is between them to organize the trading. Correspondingly, as trade becomes more global, so is the need for more global banking. Most of the major private banks already operate on a global scale, lending money to clients from most countries. At the national level, every country has its national bank. So too, the regional blocs, for example, the European Central Bank, ECB. These banks exist